French official refuses to shake Traoré's hand and regrets it in seconds. The African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa buzzed with diplomatic activity as delegates from across the continent gathered for the annual Economic Integration Summit. In the sprawling conference center, flags from 54 nations created a vibrant tapestry of African unity, while interpreters prepared for discussions in Arabic, English, French, Portuguese, and Swahili. This year's summit carried particular significance, as several Francophone nations had recently undergone political transitions that challenged traditional relationships with former colonial powers. Captain Ibrahim Traoré adjusted his military uniform as he entered the main conference hall, flanked by a modest security detail that contrasted sharply with the larger entourages accompanying other heads of state. At 34, the young president of Burkina Faso had become something of a sensation in African political circles. His rise to power through a bloodless coup, his commitment to anti-corruption measures, and his bold stance against foreign interference had earned him both admirers and critics across the continent. The seating arrangement reflected careful diplomatic choreography, with nations positioned according to complex calculations involving regional alliances, economic partnerships, and historical relationships. Burkina Faso's delegation found themselves seated near other West African states, though Traoré noted with slight amusement that their position had been moved significantly since the previous year's summit, a subtle indication of shifting international perceptions following his administration's policy changes. As delegates settled into their seats, Traoré observed the familiar ritual of pre-conference networking. Ministers exchanged pleasantries, economic advisors shared market intelligence, and security officials conducted discreet assessments of their counterparts. The atmosphere carried an undercurrent of anticipation, as everyone knew this summit would address several contentious issues, including mineral rights, security partnerships, and the ongoing debate over foreign military presence in West Africa. Among the international observers seated in a designated gallery, Ambassador Philippe Leclerc represented French interests with the practiced composure of a career diplomat. At 58, Leclerc had served in various African postings for over 2 decades, developing expertise in the complex relationships between France and its former colonies. His presence at this summit carried particular importance, as recent events in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger had significantly complicated French strategic interests in the Sahel region. Leclerc's instructions from Paris had been clear, but diplomatically nuanced: maintain formal correctness while demonstrating France's displeasure with recent policy directions in certain Francophone nations. The French government was particularly concerned about the precedent being set by young military leaders who had expelled French forces and terminated long-standing cooperation agreements. Burkina Faso, under Traoré, represented a troubling example that other nations might follow. The ambassador studied Traoré across the conference hall, noting the young president's confident bearing and the evident respect shown by other African leaders who approached him during the pre-session period. This was precisely what concerned French policymakers: Traoré's growing influence among his peers and his ability to articulate alternatives to traditional Franco-African relationships in ways that resonated across the continent. As the formal session approached, delegates began moving toward their designated positions for the opening ceremony. Protocol required a receiving line where international observers would be introduced to heads of state, creating opportunities for diplomatic exchanges that often proved more significant than the formal proceedings themselves. The line formed with practiced efficiency, each interaction carefully timed and observed by protocol officers who understood that these brief encounters could influence relationships worth billions of dollars and affect the lives of millions of people. Ambassador Leclerc took his position among other international representatives, mentally rehearsing the diplomatic language he would use when introduced to various African leaders. His particular challenge would come when presented to President Traoré. French diplomatic doctrine emphasized maintaining formal courtesy, even with governments whose policies Paris opposed, but Leclerc had received subtle indications that a cooler reception might be appropriate to signal French displeasure without creating an international incident. As the line began moving, Traoré worked his way through the introductions with characteristic directness. Unlike some leaders who relied heavily on ceremonial protocols, he engaged each representative with genuine interest, asking substantive questions about their country's positions on various issues and demonstrating detailed knowledge of continental economic trends. The African leaders present clearly appreciated this approach. Rather than the patronizing exchanges that often characterized interactions with foreign representatives, Traoré treated each conversation as an opportunity for meaningful dialogue between equals. This style had contributed significantly to his growing reputation as a voice for authentic African independence. Ambassador Leclerc observed these interactions with growing unease. Each positive exchange between Traoré and his peers reinforced the young president's position as an alternative to traditional leadership models that had maintained closer relationships with former colonial powers. From a French perspective, this represented a troubling erosion of influence that had taken decades to establish and maintain. When his turn approached, Leclerc made a decision that would have immediate and far-reaching consequences. Rather than following standard diplomatic protocol, he chose to make a statement that he hoped would demonstrate French displeasure while maintaining plausible deniability about intentional disrespect. As President Traoré extended his hand with the same courtesy he had shown all other representatives, Ambassador Leclerc hesitated for a barely perceptible moment before deliberately placing his hands behind his back and offering only a curt nod. "Mr. President," he said with calculated formality, his voice carrying just enough coolness to convey disapproval without creating an obvious breach of diplomatic etiquette. The gesture was subtle enough that casual observers might miss its significance, but unmistakable to anyone familiar with diplomatic protocols. In international relations, the refusal to shake hands with a head of state constitutes a serious insult that signals fundamental disagreement or disrespect between nations. Traoré's expression remained composed, though his eyes reflected immediate understanding of the slight. Around them, other delegates had begun to notice the unusual interaction, with conversations gradually diminishing as attention focused on the unexpected tension between the French representative and the Burkinabe president. The awkward moment stretched for what felt like an eternity, though in reality lasted only a few seconds. President Traoré maintained his extended hand for a brief moment, his expression showing neither surprise nor offense, but rather the calculated composure of someone who had anticipated exactly this type of diplomatic slight. When it became clear that Ambassador Leclerc would not reciprocate the gesture, Traoré slowly withdrew his hand and fixed the French diplomat with a steady gaze that somehow managed to convey both understanding and disappointment. "Ambassador Leclerc," Traoré said quietly, his voice carrying clearly despite the hushed tone, "I regret that France's representative chooses to demonstrate such discourtesy at a gathering dedicated to African unity and cooperation." The words were spoken without anger or indignation, but with the quiet dignity of someone stating an observed fact rather than making an accusation. This measured response somehow made the moment more powerful than if he had reacted with visible emotion or diplomatic protest. Around them, the effect was immediate and electric. The president of Ghana, who had been next in line, stopped mid-stride and stared at the French ambassador with obvious disapproval. The Nigerian delegation, overhearing the exchange, began murmuring among themselves while casting pointed looks in Leclerc's direction. Other African leaders who had been engaged in separate conversations gradually became aware that something significant was occurring. Ambassador Leclerc suddenly realized that his calculated gesture had produced consequences far beyond what he had intended. Rather than making a subtle diplomatic point that would be noted by insiders while maintaining plausible deniability, he had created a public incident that was rapidly becoming the focus of continental attention. The problem was not simply that he had refused to shake hands with one African president, but that he had done so in the presence of dozens of other African leaders who immediately understood the gesture's implication. In their eyes, the slight against Traoré represented an insult to African dignity more broadly, particularly given the setting and the summit's focus on continental sovereignty and independence. President Macky Sall of Senegal, observing the interaction from nearby, approached with obvious concern. "Is there some difficulty here?" he asked, directing his question primarily to Traoré, but glancing meaningfully at the French ambassador. "No difficulty from our perspective," Traoré replied calmly. "We simply observe that some international partners appear more comfortable with African leaders who remain subordinate to external interests than with those who prioritize their people's sovereignty." The statement was devastating in its quiet precision. Without raising his voice or making explicit accusations, Traoré had characterized the ambassador's behavior as representative of France's broader attitude toward independent African leadership. More importantly, he had done so in a way that invited other leaders to consider their own relationships with former colonial powers. The Nigerian president, approaching after completing his own introduction, immediately grasped the situation's significance. "Ambassador Leclerc," he said with diplomatic formality that barely concealed his displeasure, "I trust there has been some misunderstanding here." Leclerc found himself in an impossible position. Explaining his gesture would require acknowledging that it had been intentional, thereby confirming that France had deliberately insulted an African head of state at a continental summit. However, failing to explain would allow the incident to be interpreted as even more contemptuous, suggesting that France considered such behavior so normal as to require no justification. "There was no intended disrespect," he began, though the words sounded hollow even to himself given that the refusal to shake hands could have no other reasonable interpretation. "Then perhaps," suggested the Ghanaian president with diplomatic steel in his voice, "the ambassador would like to correct this misunderstanding immediately." The circle of African leaders surrounding the exchange had grown to include representatives from Kenya, South Africa, Ethiopia, and several other major continental powers. Each face reflected varying degrees of disapproval, and Leclerc realized with growing alarm that his attempt to send a subtle message had instead created a unified African response to what they perceived as French arrogance. More devastating still was the growing presence of media representatives who had initially been focused on photographing the standard diplomatic receiving line, but now sensed a significant story developing. Cameras were discreetly repositioning to capture whatever resolution might emerge from this unprecedented diplomatic confrontation. The South African president, whose country had experience with international isolation and understood the power of symbolic gestures, stepped forward with the authority that came from leading the continent's largest economy. "Ambassador," he said with quiet firmness, "diplomatic courtesy is not optional at African Union gatherings. If France wishes to maintain respectful relationships with African nations, its representatives must demonstrate basic respect for African leaders." The statement was diplomatic in language but devastating in implication. By framing the issue in terms of France's relationship with Africa generally rather than just with Burkina Faso specifically, he had elevated the incident from a bilateral dispute to a continental matter. Leclerc's diplomatic training told him that the situation was rapidly spiraling beyond salvage. His intended message about French displeasure with Traoré's policies had instead created an international incident that portrayed France as contemptuous of African dignity. Worse, it had unified African leaders around Traoré at precisely the moment when French policy aimed to isolate him from his continental peers. The ambassador's mind raced through possible responses, each seeming to lead to further complications. A full apology would acknowledge wrongdoing that would have consequences for his career and for French diplomatic relations across Africa. Continued defiance would deepen the crisis and potentially lead to his expulsion from the summit. Most problematically, he realized that his gesture had inadvertently provided Traoré with exactly the type of international platform he needed to demonstrate the validity of his arguments about French neo-colonial attitudes. What had been intended as a subtle signal of disapproval had instead become proof of the very arrogance that Traoré had been criticizing. As the circle of African leaders continued to expand around the diplomatic standoff, Ambassador Leclerc could feel the weight of continental disapproval settling upon him like a suffocating blanket. What had begun as a calculated gesture designed to demonstrate French displeasure was rapidly transforming into a public relations disaster that threatened to undermine decades of carefully cultivated Franco-African relationships. The president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, arrived at the scene with the quiet intensity that had made him one of Africa's most respected leaders. His presence immediately elevated the confrontation's significance, as other delegates recognized that someone of his stature would not involve himself in minor diplomatic disputes. Ambassador Leclerc, Kagame said with the precise diction that characterized his public statements, I am curious to understand France's position regarding diplomatic courtesy at African Union gatherings. The question was phrased with deceptive simplicity, but Leclerc recognized the trap it represented. Any response that justified his behavior would implicitly acknowledge France's right to determine which African leaders deserved respect, while an apology would amount to admitting deliberate disrespect for an African head of state. President Traoré, meanwhile, maintained his position with remarkable composure, neither retreating from the confrontation nor escalating it through inflammatory rhetoric. His calm dignity in the face of deliberate disrespect was producing exactly the effect he might have hoped for. Other African leaders were drawing their own conclusions about the contrast between his measured professionalism and the French representative's breach of diplomatic protocol. The media presence was also expanding as word of the unusual confrontation spread throughout the conference center. Journalists who had been covering routine summit preparations suddenly found themselves witnessing a dramatic illustration of the tensions that had been building between France and several of its former colonies. More African leaders continued arriving at the scene, creating an impromptu gathering that was beginning to resemble a continental intervention rather than a diplomatic receiving line. The president of Algeria, whose country had its own complex history with France, positioned himself prominently within the circle, his presence adding weight to the growing chorus of disapproval. In Algeria, he observed with quiet authority, we learned long ago that true independence requires demanding respect from former colonial powers. Diplomatic courtesy is not a favor to be granted or withheld based on political preferences. His words carried particular significance given Algeria's history of armed struggle for independence and its subsequent experience maintaining sovereignty despite French pressure. The implicit comparison between Traoré's current position and Algeria's historical experience was not lost on anyone present. Ambassador Leclerc felt the diplomatic ground shifting beneath his feet as he realized that his gesture had inadvertently created exactly the type of unified African response that French policy sought to prevent. Rather than isolating Traoré, his behavior had provided the young president with a platform to demonstrate both his dignity under pressure and the solidarity he enjoyed among his continental peers. The Ethiopian prime minister, representing the summit's host country, approached with obvious concern about the incident's potential impact on the gathering's proceedings. Ambassador, he said with diplomatic formality, perhaps we could resolve this misunderstanding quickly so that our important discussions can proceed without distraction. The suggestion carried unmistakable implications. Either the situation would be resolved through French acknowledgement of inappropriate behavior, or it would continue to overshadow the entire summit. For the host country, having a major diplomatic incident dominate coverage of their carefully planned gathering was an unacceptable outcome. Leclerc's phone buzzed with an urgent message from his staff, undoubtedly reporting that news of the confrontation was already reaching international media outlets. In the age of social media and instant global communication, diplomatic incidents could not be contained within conference halls. Whatever happened next would be scrutinized by audiences far beyond the African Union membership. The ambassador's training told him that damage control required immediate action, but his instructions from Paris had emphasized the importance of demonstrating French displeasure with Traoré's policy. The conflict between tactical necessity and strategic objectives left him paralyzed in a moment that demanded decisive action. President Traoré, sensing the ambassador's dilemma, chose that moment to demonstrate the leadership qualities that had earned him respect across Africa. Rather than allowing the French representative to suffer further humiliation, he stepped forward with a gesture that would transform the entire dynamic. Ambassador Leclerc, he said with quiet authority, I believe there has been a misunderstanding here. Perhaps you would like another opportunity to demonstrate France's respect for African leadership and continental sovereignty. The offer was gracious in form but devastating in substance. By framing a potential resolution in terms of France's respect for Africa generally, Traoré had made acceptance of his gesture a continental, rather than bilateral issue. Refusing would now represent not just continued disrespect for Burkina Faso, but contempt for African dignity itself. The circle of African leaders watched with intense attention as Leclerc faced a decision that would have consequences far beyond the immediate moment. His response would be interpreted as representing France's attitude toward African independence and would influence relationships across the continent for years to come. The weight of that responsibility, combined with the growing realization of how catastrophically his initial gesture had backfired, finally broke through the ambassador's diplomatic paralysis. The calculation was suddenly simple: continue defying the entire African Union leadership, or acknowledge his mistake and attempt damage control. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, as Ambassador Leclerc weighed his impossible options. Around him, the circle of African leaders waited with varying expressions of expectation, disapproval, and curiosity about how France's representative would respond to this unprecedented diplomatic crisis. The weight of their collective gaze, combined with the growing media attention and the realization of how badly he had miscalculated, finally forced the ambassador into action. "President Traoré," Leclerc began, his voice noticeably strained as he abandoned the calculated coolness that had characterized his earlier demeanor. I must acknowledge that my behavior was inappropriate for this distinguished gathering." The words came slowly, each syllable seeming to cost him considerable effort, as his diplomatic training warred with his political instructions. The admission represented not just personal embarrassment, but a fundamental contradiction of the French policy he had been sent to implement. "The African Union represents the legitimate aspirations of the African people for unity and self-determination," he continued, the formal language providing some refuge from the personal humiliation of the moment. France's representative should demonstrate appropriate respect for that institution and its leaders. President Traoré listened with the same measured composure he had maintained throughout the confrontation, neither gloating over the ambassador's obvious discomfort nor rushing to make his capitulation easier. The silence that followed Leclerc's words allowed their full significance to register with everyone present. "Furthermore," the ambassador added, clearly recognizing that his initial statement had been insufficient, "I extend my personal apologies to President Traoré and to all the distinguished leaders present for this regrettable breach of diplomatic protocol." With visible reluctance and obvious internal struggle, Leclerc finally extended his hand toward the Burkinabe president. The gesture came nearly 5 minutes after Traoré's initial offer of courtesy, making it clear to everyone present that this was not a spontaneous act of diplomacy, but a forced acknowledgement of inappropriate behavior. Traoré accepted the handshake with the same dignity he had shown throughout the incident, neither lingering over his victory nor rushing to ease the ambassador's embarrassment. The brief contact lasted exactly as long as diplomatic protocol required, no longer, no shorter. "Thank you, Ambassador," Traoré said simply. "I believe this demonstrates that respectful dialogue between Africa and its international partners remains possible when all parties recognize the fundamental equality of sovereign nations." The statement was perfectly calibrated to maximize the incident's symbolic impact, while providing the French representative with a face-saving framework for his capitulation. By characterizing the resolution in terms of dialogue between equals, Traoré had transformed what could have been a humiliating defeat for France into a lesson about proper diplomatic conduct. The African leaders surrounding the exchange began to relax visibly as the immediate crisis passed, though the implications of what they had witnessed would continue to resonate long after the summit concluded. Several presidents nodded approvingly at Traoré's gracious handling of the situation, recognizing both his firmness in demanding respect and his magnanimity in accepting the ambassador's belated apology. Paul Kagame was the first to speak after the handshake, his words carrying the authority of someone who had personally navigated complex relationships with former colonial powers. "This incident reminds us that true partnership requires mutual respect. African leaders will not accept disrespectful treatment, regardless of the historical relationships between our nations." The Algerian president added his own observation, drawing on his country's experience with French relations. "Independence means having the confidence to demand appropriate treatment while remaining open to respectful cooperation. President Traoré has demonstrated both qualities admirably." Ambassador Leclerc found himself in the awkward position of listening to African leaders discuss the lessons to be drawn from his own inappropriate behavior. The diplomatic training that had served him well in previous postings proved inadequate for managing a situation where he had become the negative example in a continental discussion about sovereignty and respect. The media representatives who had gathered to witness the confrontation's resolution immediately began transmitting reports about the unprecedented incident. The story of a French ambassador being forced to apologize publicly to an African president for refusing to shake his hand would dominate news cycles across the continent and beyond. More importantly, for long-term diplomatic relationships, video footage of the entire incident was already circulating on social media platforms, where it would be viewed by millions of people as an illustration of changing power dynamics between Africa and its former colonial powers. The Ethiopian Prime Minister, eager to restore focus to the summit's official agenda, attempted to guide the discussion toward a conclusion. I believe this incident demonstrates the importance of the respectful dialogue we hope to achieve in our formal sessions. Perhaps we can now proceed with our planned proceedings. However, the damage to France's diplomatic position extended far beyond the immediate embarrassment of the ambassador's forced apology. The incident had provided Traoré with exactly the type of continental platform he needed to demonstrate his arguments about neo-colonial attitudes and the necessity of demanding respect for African sovereignty. More strategically damaging from a French perspective was the way the incident had unified African leaders around principles of dignity and respect that directly challenged traditional patterns of Franco-African relation. What had begun as an attempt to isolate Traoré had instead elevated him to the status of a continental spokesperson for African independence. In the hours following the dramatic confrontation, the diplomatic reverberations extended far beyond the African Union Conference Hall. Ambassador Leclerc's forced apology had been captured on multiple cameras and was rapidly spreading across social media platforms, where it was being interpreted as a symbolic moment in the evolution of Franco-African relations. The hashtag #ChoqueRespectAfrica began trending globally, with the handshake incident serving as a catalyst for broader discussions about sovereignty, dignity, and post-colonial relationships. President Traoré, meanwhile, had transformed what could have been a minor diplomatic slight into a masterclass in leadership under pressure. His measured response to disrespectful treatment, combined with his gracious acceptance of the eventual apology, had demonstrated the type of dignified strength that resonated across the African continent and beyond. The immediate impact on the summit itself was profound. When formal sessions resumed, Traoré found himself at the center of attention from fellow African leaders who had witnessed his handling of the crisis. The incident had inadvertently provided him with enhanced credibility and moral authority that strengthened his voice in subsequent discussions about continental integration and independence. During the economic policy panel that afternoon, Traoré's comments about African self-determination and resistance to external pressure carried added weight, given the morning's events. When he spoke about the need for African nations to demand respectful treatment from international partners, his words resonated with an audience that had just seen him embody those principles in real time. This morning's incident illustrates why Africa must approach international partnerships from a position of strength and self-respect, he told the assembled delegate. We cannot build meaningful cooperation with partners who view us as subordinates rather than equals. The statement drew sustained applause from the African audience, while international observers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The French delegation, in particular, appeared deeply uncomfortable as Traoré effectively used their representatives' inappropriate behavior as evidence for his broader arguments about neo-colonial attitudes. Ambassador Leclerc, meanwhile, faced the immediate challenge of damage control both within the summit and in his communications with Paris. His afternoon was consumed by urgent phone calls with French officials who were struggling to understand how a routine diplomatic interaction had escalated into an international incident that portrayed France in such negative terms. The French Foreign Ministry's initial response emphasized that Leclerc's behavior did not represent official French policy, but this statement only served to highlight the disconnect between France's stated commitment to respectful African partnerships and the actual behavior of its representative. More problematically for French interests, the incident was being interpreted across Africa as revealing France's true attitude toward independent African leadership. Social media commentary from African users overwhelmingly framed the confrontation as evidence that France remained uncomfortable with African leaders who prioritized sovereignty over traditional dependency relationships. The long-term diplomatic consequences became apparent as the summit progressed. African leaders who had previously maintained neutrality in discussions about French involvement in West Africa began expressing more critical perspectives. The incident had shifted the continental conversation in ways that directly undermined French strategic objectives. By the summit's final day, it was clear that Ambassador Leclerc's attempt to demonstrate French displeasure with Traoré's policies had achieved exactly the opposite of its intended effect. Rather than isolating the Burkinabe president, it had elevated him to continental prominence while portraying France as resistant to African independence and dignity. The closing ceremony provided a final illustration of how dramatically the diplomatic landscape had shifted. When President Traoré delivered his remarks to the full assembly, he received one of the longest standing ovations of the entire summit. His message about African unity and self-determination resonated powerfully with an audience that had witnessed his personal embodiment of those principles. "The future of Africa lies in our ability to engage with the world as equals," he declared in his closing statement. "We welcome respectful partnerships with all nations, but we will no longer accept relationships based on paternalism or disrespect." The words carried particular impact given the context of the morning's events, and the sustained applause that followed demonstrated the continental support he had gained through his dignified handling of the crisis. Ambassador Leclerc's departure from the summit was notably low-key, in stark contrast to the ceremonial send-offs typically accorded to major diplomatic representatives. The French delegation's early exit was widely interpreted as an acknowledgement that their position had become untenable following the handshake incident. In his final report to Paris, Leclerc would be forced to acknowledge that his attempt to signal French displeasure had instead provided Traoré with a continental platform to demonstrate leadership and had unified African opinion around principles that directly challenged French interests in the region. The incident would be studied in diplomatic academies for years to come as an example of how miscalculated gestures could transform routine interactions into defining moments. For Ambassador Leclerc personally, it marked the effective end of a distinguished career, as he was quietly transferred to a domestic position shortly after returning to France. For President Traoré, however, the confrontation marked the beginning of enhanced continental leadership. The dignity and strength he had displayed under pressure had demonstrated to African audiences that respectful but firm resistance to external pressure was both possible and effective. The handshake that almost didn't happen had become a symbol of changing power dynamics between Africa and its former colonial powers, illustrating that the continent's new generation of leaders would demand the respect that previous generations had been denied. In refusing to accept disrespectful treatment, and then graciously accepting an apology when it came, Traoré had provided a template for dignified African leadership that would inspire similar approaches across the continent. Most importantly, the incident demonstrated that France's traditional ability to influence African politics through diplomatic pressure was no longer assured, and that African leaders who prioritized sovereignty and dignity could expect continental support when they stood firm against external intimidation.